this is BioPhoenix here, and we're back in October season. And the horror-themed game we're going to be playing is on PS1, and it happens to be Yakata Nightmare Project. So it is a turn-based RPG that was developed by Chime Corporation and published by Ask. And by the way, their company logo looks like the Pokemon Unknown with the letter A. And as for the company Chime Corporation, they've done quite a few different games, even starting out with some PC98 games, but two that I want to briefly mention are Tale on the Dreamcast, and apparently they did the Cowboy Bebop game on PS2, which is ironic because as I was playing through this game, that game actually got fan translated, which is awesome. And it came out in the year 1998, which is a fantastic year for video games. Now, before we get moving on to the game's story, one thing I do have to mention I thought was pretty interesting to discover was that this game's story was loosely based after a series of novels by Yukito Ayatsuji. And for those that don't know that name, that was the guy that wrote the original novel to Another, which eventually got turned into an anime and manga series. And I really enjoyed that show a hell lot, so when I found out that this game has some sort of relations to the guy who created Another, then that got me really excited. And I also found out too that 3 of the books that are loosely related to this game have actually came out over here in English, which is pretty great. So without further ado, let's get moving on and start talking about the game's story. So it begins with our main character named Yukiya, and he is going on an island with his friends, and his other friends happen to be Miriko, Mizuki, and Suichi. But when they arrive on the island, an accident happens, and of course, our main character can't remember anything. Yeah, don't you love it when that happens? So as he's traveling around the island, he eventually sees a big mansion that is called the Blue Mansion. And once he goes inside, he ends up reuniting with his other friends, and then they get introduced to the owner of the mansion, Chiori Nakamura. And she explains that her father built all these different mansions, but they all happen to have a very strange side effect where everyone that sleeps in them, the nightmares they have go absolutely ballistic. And the reason she invited these people was because they apparently have the most potential at fixing the problem. And another thing she does mention that did caught my interest, although I'm not 100% sure how accurate my phone translated it, so do forgive me if it is wrong, but supposedly, the whole nightmare aspect of these mansions gets so bad that apparently everyone outside the mansion can't dream anymore. Which I think is a pretty interesting concept. So after all that, all the characters go to sleep, and once they wake back up, they find that Chiori is dead. So all the main characters and the other staff members that help out at the mansion end up gathering around trying to figure out who killed her. Now so far, this sounds like a pretty typical murder mystery plot, but this part that I'm about to explain is where it kinda goes a little over the top. So one of the main characters, Shuichi, apparently has multiple personalities, and I don't just mean that, oh, he just changes his voice. No, he literally transforms into another character as if he's a shapeshifter or something. So he ends up transforming into a girl named Itagawa Ranko, yes, who is a reference to the real-life novelist Itagawa Rampo. So whenever Ranko shows up, she pretty much takes over the whole detective aspect to the game's story. But if you think that wasn't crazy enough, there's another character that he can transform into, and his name is Jushin Tiger. Yes, related to Jushin Liger, and he even looks almost exactly like him too, which is kinda awesome. And of course, there are other characters that he does transform into, but I don't want to give away everything here. But those are the earlier ones that do show up that definitely tell you that, yeah, you're gonna be in for one wild ride with this one. So after they're done investigating the body of Chiori, they end up going to a mansion that looks like a complete circle, and once they get in there, they realize that this mansion can teleport them to other mansions across the island. And that pretty much sums up the basics of what you need to know about the story. So yeah, every time you go inside the Circle Mansion, that pretty much takes you to the next chapter, and every mansion is its own chapter. And the progression of the game usually goes like Blue Mansion, another mansion, then you go back to the Blue Mansion, and then you go back to another mansion, and then yeah, just back and forth. And there are other playable characters that do join your party in this game, and I'm not going to give away all of them, but the first ones that I will mention are Yuria, who has a bit of a priestess vibe, and then there's also Maya, who is a living doll, and then there's even a dog that joins in too. And like I always say when it comes to covering these really obscure story-driven games, because very few people have played them, I'm not going to be giving away any major spoilers for a few reasons, but mainly because I always encourage people at trying these really weird off-the-wall games that I play, and also because this game is an RPG with a pretty big story attached with it. Yeah, I'm not gonna rob people's experience when they play this game by just spoon-feeding you everything about it, cause, you know, that's just not that exciting. So later on in this video, I am gonna mention a couple different things about the story, but I'm not gonna give away any major details or twists or anything. Just wanted to keep that clear. So now, let's get moving on and start talking about the game's gameplay. So the exploration is all done in top-down view, and I do think it is nice that you actually do see a blue or a red symbol over a door, letting you know that it's either locked or unlocked. And within most mansions of the game, there won't be any random encounters, but there are some areas that are an exception. But where most of the random encounters happen is within the nightmare sections. And the nightmare sections are basically your dungeons in the game. So you do the usual stuff, like you run around, find items, you also do a little bit of puzzles by taking certain items and put it into another place. You can also buy and sell stuff to a merchant that looks almost like something out of Studio Ghibli. And there is an item crafting station where you can combine different nightmare crystals, which is a pretty common item that you can find. And you just make new items with them. Pretty simple stuff. And all these different crystals that you see throughout the dungeon, at first you'd be thinking that this is the save station, but no. The save stations are these hexagons that are on the ground. The blue one is for saving, and the green one also saves, but it does heal you as well, so those ones are like your perfect grinding spots. Now you're probably wondering, what are these taller ones for? They're pretty much beacons, so every time you hit one, it changes color, and when you look at the map, you'll see that it changes color, so therefore it tells you where you are on the map. So that's the basics of exploration, but as for the battle system, it's a typical turn-based combat system, so all the different options you have is magic, physical attack, using an item, moving a character around the battlefield, defend, and escape. So it's pretty straightforward, but the one thing that does make it slightly different, well, different enough, is that using attack or magic will take up 1, and after when that's done, you can use any of the defensive moves with one character. And sometimes when you get criticals, you can gain an extra AP, so therefore you can attack again, and you can just keep doing that as many times as you can. So yeah, the battles in this game are pretty easy to figure out and are not confusing at all. But we'll touch base on a few other things about the combat and the exploration later, so now let's get moving on and start talking about the other things, like the graphics. And I think they're quite nice. But I'd say my favorite part about the graphics would have to be some of the interior designs that they have for some of the mansions. For an example, like with the blue one, there's a lot of rooms that have a lot of like furniture in them, and just the way how they have it laid out is just, it's kind of nice looking. Also, another attention to detail that I thought was interesting, there is a lot of bathrooms throughout this game. Like, every single guest room gets their own bathroom, and they did not skip out on any of them. And I just think it's neat, because when you really think about like all these other RPGs where you go inside someone's house, usually it's just a kitchen, a dining room table, and a bed in a corner. Of course, there are some exceptions where they do throw in a couple little things, but usually they don't really include a bathroom that often. So the fact that this game happens to have a floor plan for all the mansions that are somewhat realistic looking, at least when it comes to like how they include everything, is actually kind of a nice little detail. And as for the character sprites, they kind of look like toys that they made in real life and then they just digitized them into the game. And I think it's decent looking, even though they are a little bit on the fuzzier side, but one attention to detail that I do like that they did with them is that whenever you go to a nightmare world, they actually change their clothing, and not just with the character models, but even in the portraits too. Yeah, like one of them dresses up like a frickin' ninja. And this whole idea really makes me think of Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, which is awesome. So obviously I do like it for that reason, but I also like it because they threw in some extra detail to them that they didn't necessarily have to. They could have just made them look the same throughout the whole damn game, but no, they threw in some extra stuff, which I like. With all these good stuff that I've been mentioning, one unfortunate thing that I don't like as much is that most of the dungeons in this game use a lot of the same textures for their hallways, and because of this, it actually makes navigating through some of them a little bit confusing because everything just looks the frickin' same. I guess that's why they gave you those beacon things. But I still think that some of these dungeons could use a little bit of differences throughout their hallways to make it at least a little bit easier. And as for the monster designs in this game, it's a bit of a mixed bag, where you got some that are pretty cool and weird looking, which I like, and then you got some that are hopelessly generic. Like, to give you an example of one, there's an enemy that's literally just a cone shape. That is it. It's like something that you've seen in like math class or something. In fact, it actually kind of looks like a bugle. Anyone remember those chips called bugles? Yeah, that shit was the bomb. But like I said, there's a couple standout ones that I do like. Like, you got killer ballerina dolls. There's creepy mermaids, and then there's some gestures, just to name a couple, but I would say that some of the bosses are probably some of the more intriguing ones. Like, one example that I'll show off here is that you got a doll who happens to have chicken legs, and then they have 6 arms that shoot out from her back. I don't know, it's weird, but it's kinda cool. But even with some of the best, cooler, weird designs that this game has, it's still nowhere near on the same level as, you know, Shadow Hearts or Desperia. But it still has a decent amount of them that I do like and are pretty cool for what they are. And some of the attack animations in this game, I mean, they're pretty typical for PS1 standards, and for the most part are nothing super crazy, but the two that I do think are a bit amusing are the ones that when you use an item on someone, he gives them a cube, and it kind of looks like, here, eat this cube. And whenever the main character uses the tornado spell, for some reason it's like super brown. Like, what is this supposed to be, a shitnado? But other than those two, yeah, there's nothing much else to say about them. And as for the game's anime cutscenes, they do look a little bit on the lower budget side for anime standards, but I suppose it does the job just fine, as most of them are pretty short. So overall, I'd say the graphics in this game are a little bit of a mixed bag, but I would say there's definitely more decent and good than bad. Well, there's really no bad, really. It's more so just a little bit on the mid side. And with knowing that, yeah, the graphics are not like the most amazing you'll ever see on PS1 in 1998, but I do think it still has its cool aesthetics going for it. And as for the game's music, well, damn, I gotta say, the music in this game is pretty great. And there's no track in this game that I dislike at all. So there's quite a bit of variety of different stuff, where obviously you get the more creepy, atmospheric stuff, which is awesome. And then when Jushin Tiger comes in, his theme song is just super badass sounding. It almost kind of sounds like an East theme. But probably two of my favorite tracks would have to be the Clock Tower themes. Yeah, there's 2 of them, and I love both of them. So the first one is a more somber piano track with some light guitar in the background. It's just very beautiful sounding. And the other one is also a very beautiful orchestrated track, and this one almost kind of sounds like the opening theme to the anime Elfen Lied. And love it or hate that show, you gotta admit, that opening theme is amazing. And weirdly enough, and this is a little off topic here, but this is actually not the first time that I've heard a song in a video game that sounds similar to that theme, but also predated it as well. So the first one that I've heard before was the main menu theme within the game SOS on Super Nintendo, the game that's about a sinking ship. It's a pretty interesting game. Yeah, I've always really wanted to mention that, but just never really had, like, the perfect opportunity to it until now. So, yeah, there you go. There's 2 songs in video games that sound similar to an anime theme that came way later. And the last one that I'm going to mention here, because honestly, I could probably talk about, like, every song on this OST, but I won't because we'd be here forever, is that the Labyrinth Mansion theme is such a bop. It has a bit of light ambient techno vibes to it. Well, I guess before moving on, I should also mention that, yeah, even the boss and battle music in this game are all really great too, and I never got sick of them either. So yeah, I can definitely say for sure that the soundtrack is definitely worth listening to. Even outside of the game, it's all really good stuff. And as for the game's voice acting, there is a lot of voice actors in this game, and I think they all do a really good job as far as I can tell. Although I'm not going to go over every single one here because there's a lot. But it is worth noting that a lot of these actors may be considered as big ones today, but at the time when this game came out, they were fairly new, so it is pretty interesting that this is some of their more earlier stuff. But the only one that I do want to bring up here, because it is both sad but also very ominous, was that the voice actor for Chiori, you know, the one that gets murdered in the game, she was voiced by Shiho Niyama. And for those that don't know, she died at a very young age, and she actually died not that long after this game came out. So it's not only very tragic and sad, but it also is very creepy as well. So now, if you want to go out and buy yourself a copy of this game, there's actually quite a few of them I've seen, and thankfully this is yet another game that's actually not stupidly overpriced. I've seen a lot of them go for about $20 to $50, but usually between like 20 and 30. So thankfully this is a game that if you wanted to own a physical copy of it, it's not going to cost you an arm and a leg to get. And then next thing you know, like you're watching this 10 years from now and it's going to be like tripled the price, but who knows. And now, finally, as for my overall thoughts on Yakata Nightmare Project, is that it's a pretty decently enjoyable game. but is by no means a fantastical classic. Because before I get into why, I do want to mention that when it comes to all these horror-themed RPGs, in my opinion, the GOATs happen to be Parasite Eve and Shadow Hearts, and yeah, I don't think this game is anywhere near on that level, and that's okay, not everything has to be on that level to be good. And then below that, I would put Desperia, which was another game that I really liked, but did have a couple flaws here and there, but it was still a very good, enjoyable game. And this one, yeah, I would put it underneath that one. But it's still leagues ahead of that really crappy Super Nintendo one I played. What the frick was it called again? It was like La Place No More, whatever, I don't know. Like, that game just sucked. So now let's get into the things that I liked and didn't like that I haven't mentioned yet. So when it comes to the overall story, I thought it was really good and interesting throughout. It was always exciting to see what mansions you were going to go through next, and it was also fun to see the mystery aspect unfold as you progress through the game. And yeah, I will admit, there was a couple things with the twists in this game that were a little bit predictable, but I still think that they did them in a very interesting way that was still very fun. But there were a couple genuinely good surprises though. But as much as I do like this game's story, I do think that some of the characters in this game could be a little bit better. But I can say without a doubt that the best character in the whole game in my opinion would be Suichi, you know, the guy that transforms into the other characters there. And while that aspect may seem a little bit gimmicky and over the top, I actually do like it though. But that's not my main reason why he's my favorite though. The main reason he's my favorite is because I actually found his backstory was the most interesting one that I thought was really good and well written. Plus his dialogue was definitely the most amusing one that stood out to me the most. He's one of those characters that comes off as like a badass character, but deep down he has a good heart inside. So yeah, without a doubt, he is easily my favorite. But as for the rest of them though, like, I will say this, none of the characters are downright bad or annoying or anything like that at all, but I just think that all the other ones were nowhere near on his level and were just kind of average and decent. For an example, the main character Yukia in this game, he's just your typical hero character that's trying to be a good guy, and he also happens to have amnesia. Like, we haven't heard that like a million times, and yeah, he's generic as fuck. But the other characters, I do think are a little bit better than him, like they do have a couple interesting good moments here and there, but I wouldn't call them fantastically amazing. So despite the characters being a little all over the place, I still think that the story overall is still fairly strong and interesting. And as for the game's combat, like I said before, it is very straightforward, and it's nothing super revolutionary, and there's nothing outright wrong with it, outside of maybe some battle animations can be a little bit on the slower side, but other than that, everything else works well the way it should. But with that said, I did find out that there is a pretty big cheese tactic that you can do throughout this game, and I didn't even realize you can do it until like almost near the end of the game. So in case you're wondering how to do it, is that you have 2 units go directly behind the enemy, and then you keep 2 of them in front of them, and every time you attack them from behind, you do a little bit more damage than you normally would, and the enemy will automatically face to where the attack just came from. So when you have 2 units on each side directly facing each other, then his back is always going to be facing towards one of your characters, therefore yeah, you're basically just gangbanging the fuck out of him. And that tactic right there makes this game a hell lot easier, but I will say, as someone that did play through a good portion of this game without using that because, you know, I didn't think to do it, the game's difficulty was still not that hard. Like, there was a couple parts that were a little bit tricky, but it was not brutally difficult. So yeah, also just like I said about Desperia last year, is that it's a game that you can easily cheese the game if you wanted to, but you can also choose not to. Now this next thing I'm going to talk about is probably my biggest complaint with the game, easily the biggest flaw for me, is that the exploration in this game can be a slog. Now, I did mention earlier that a lot of the hallways in this game do look the same and it makes things confusing. And yeah, that's a big part of what I'm talking about right now. But another thing to add on to this is the map. So first of all, pulling up the map in this game is not snappy and quick at all. It's very slow and a bit sluggish. And even putting away the map to get back to exploring is also a bit slow as well. But one thing that I thought was really dumb was that whenever you're in a mansion section when there's no monsters and you pull up the map, you can see yourself on the map with that little triangle thing. But when you look at the map when you're in a dungeon, yeah, they got rid of that. So that's why that they put those crystal beacon things as supposed to help you guide through it. But man, like when you're at a part where there's like none of those beacons around, man, it is such a bitch to get around. It also makes the backtracking in this game way more annoying because, like I mentioned, a lot of the puzzles in this game is taking an item and then using that item to get another item. Okay, I know that just sounded stupid the way I said it, but that's literally how it goes. So because of the mazes being a little bit confusing where a lot of it looks the same, and then you got the map that is like not the most helpful ever, and you have to pull it up really slowly, yeah, trying to get all these key items that you're trying to progress through the game can really feel like a slog a lot of the times, and also does make some backtracking pretty annoying. Hell, there's even a shit ton of backtracking you gotta do even when you're not fighting in a dungeon. Like, for an example, this Labyrinth mansion can go fuck itself. Like, look at this shit. Not only is this mansion way too big, but it also just looks really ugly too. It's literally just a big flat box. This is definitely the laziest mansion design in this game. And to make matters worse, the whole interior maze is also just everything looks the same and it's very boring to look at, but also, there are sections of this mansion that are all blacked out, and when you cross over it, the game has to load a bit. So yeah, that's another thing of like why I think this mansion is just way too big for its own good. Proving that yeah, just because something is big, it doesn't mean it's better. And yeah, I absolutely hated this part. This part was just not fun at all. The only thing that I don't hate about it was the music, which is way too awesome for it, and also that drunk guy that thinks he's a caterpillar. He was actually kind of funny. But outside of these two things, this mansion can get nuked for all I fucking care. And thankfully, while the other areas of the game are nowhere near as bad as that, they still happen to have some tedious moments. So to me, that is easily the one thing about this game that kind of holds it back quite a bit. And I also do feel like that a lot of these moments did make the game feel like it was a lot longer than it was. But despite of those things, I thought at least everything else was decent to pretty good, and even does have a couple things that do reach greatness, mostly being the music. So of knowing this, yeah, this is going to be a tough one to recommend. Obviously, it's tough to recommend a game that's only in Japanese to everyone, but let's just say if this game did happen to have an English translation making it easier to play, it's still a little bit tough for the sloggy moments. But if you do want a really solid mystery story with some weird elements thrown in there, I do think it is a pretty good one for that. But you have to be perfectly okay and being able to tolerate a lot of the stuff that I mentioned earlier. So yeah, overall, I do kind of like this game for what it is. Like, I did have some fun with it, and I'm glad to have finally played it for that it's a game that I've always been interested in. But it is by no means a top-tier PS1 RPG, and not that I expect everything has to be top-tier, but I just wouldn't consider it to be a top favorite game on the system. But if you did want to try this game out sometime soon, then I can say that there is a guide on YouTube that was very helpful, and that was from Hyde Vista. So a huge thank you to that walkthrough. So that being said, that'll be it for this year's October season, so as always, thank you for watching and commenting, and have yourselves a great day.